What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to learn how to implement sign in with Apple in SwiftUI. So here is our handy dandy sign in with Apple button. We can go ahead and tap on it and you get the sign in sheet as expected. We have the option to go ahead and edit our name in here if we wanted to. And we can of course go ahead and actually share our email or choose not to share the email down here. We can go ahead and continue. Now, I'm not going to actually sign in right now because I need to type in my password, but we'll take a look at how to implement this, how to also go about supporting light mode and dark mode since it's not done out of the box, and everything in between. So if that sounds good, make sure you start by destroying the like button down below. Helps out incredibly. I really appreciate it. Hit subscribe if you're into iOS and want to stick around. That all said, let's get into the video. All right, let's get started by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. We're going to stick with the app template under iOS. Let's go ahead and give this project a name of sign in with Apple Swift UI. Make sure your actual language is set to Swift and both your lifecycle and interface are set to Swift UI. Go ahead and continue, save the project wherever you'd like. I'll toss it onto my desktop. And first things first, let's go ahead and close this right panel. We don't need it. We'll go ahead and expand our Xcode window. Maybe we'll change the preview device to be a 12 Pro Max since it's usually the device that I end up using. And let's go ahead and hit resume on the right hand side to load up our preview like so. So the first thing we actually need to do before we get into the weed of writing our code here is we need to actually enable the capability for sign in with Apple. So come to this screen and hit signing and capabilities at the top. The first thing you want to go ahead and do here is select a team, which I'm going to select my team from the dropdown. You do need an Apple developer account to follow along here. Then we want to add a capability. So I'm going to go ahead and look for the sign in with Apple capability. Go ahead and add it, and you're going to see a little spinner here that says waiting to repair. Basically what's going on is Xcode is taking care of setting up our provisioning profile and certificates in the developer portal. That way we don't have to go in there manually on developer.apple.com and do it. So if you do see any error here when this process is going on, you might need to log in directly and take a look at it, but it looks like it has succeeded for us. So now we can get back to our content view and get into the code. So the basic premise of setting this up is we need a sign in with Apple button. We want to configure the request, and then we want to handle the result. So let's go ahead and create a navigation view with a VStack in it, which is going to wrap our sign in with Apple button. Let me go ahead and give this a nice title so it looks somewhat like we made an effort. And to bring in the sign in with Apple button, we want to go ahead and import the Authentication Services framework from Apple. This contains the sign in with Apple button, and we want to go ahead and pick the initializer with the 3 parameters that you see here. The first one is what you want the actual button to say. So we have continue, sign in, or sign up. We're going to say continue. The next parameter here is a closure to be able to configure the request, which we'll handle momentarily. And lastly, this third parameter here is to handle the result. So before we actually go ahead and implement those 2 blocks, let's go ahead and hit resume to see what our UI is looking like. So here's the first problem. Apple decided to play a fast one on us and not set a size to the button itself. So we need to go ahead and set a frame height to the button ourselves. We'll stick with 50. And I'm also going to add padding and a little corner radius to make it look just a little nicer. The other thing that you'll notice when you run it on a device, it doesn't actually show up in the preview, is that this button does not adjust for light mode and dark mode out of the box. So we need to actually support that manually, which is fairly straightforward, a little annoying, but we can do it. So we want to observe the color scheme environment here, the environment property wrapper. So we're going to say color scheme is var color scheme, just like that. And now we can use this to stylize our button here. So here there is a wrapper, or rather a modifier is what I'm looking for, which is sign in with Apple button style. And in here we can specify black or white, but instead of doing either of those, we're going to say if the color scheme is dark, we want to go ahead and use white. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and use black for light mode. So now that we have our UI beautification kind of done here, let's go ahead and start dealing with actually handling the request. So on the request, in this first block, all we need to say is which scopes do we want to actually get out of the request, aka what user info, and we care about the user's email and their full name. And in the second block here, we want to basically switch on this result here, and we want to basically handle the success case, which gives us a auth object, and then we also want to handle the failure case, which gives us a error, which we'll just print out here. Now, once we have this auth object, we want to further switch on the auth object's credential. So we're going to say switch auth.credential, and the one that we're interested in for basic kind of setup is called a auth Apple credential, Apple ID credential, but I'll just shorthand it here. And we're going to say this is as a AS authorization Apple ID credential is what I'm looking for. And basically, this credential has all the information from the user on it, but we'll also want to handle the default case, which we're not going to do anything today. So let me go ahead and actually expand this a little bit so it's not line wrapping there. We'll close this left panel maybe. And basically, what we are getting a warning about here is that we're not actually using this. But on the auth Apple credential, we can actually just call this credential to make our lives easier. We can get information about the user. So we can say their email is credential.email. Pretty simple. Then we can also get their first name is their credential dot, I think there is a full name, which has components on it. And I think they call it like given name and family name. So let's see what they call it. We've got a family name, which is their last name. So we've got given name, which is what we care about. And this is family name, which is their last name. And most importantly, you can get their user ID that Apple provides by saying credential .user. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is the only piece of information that you'll get again, let's say the user deletes your app and comes back to sign in again, is the user ID. The email, first name, and last name you do not get after the first time the user has authenticated. So it's critical that you actually cache these either in like your backend if you're using like Firebase or some type of database, or if you cache it, onto the current app sessions persistence, something like user defaults maybe. So we'll say this is user info here, and we have user ID. So before we move along any further, let's talk about caching it. I'm going to do a very basic example of how you can cache it. We're just going to use app storage. So that is a property wrapper that is available in SwiftUI. So I'm going to say there is one for email, which is of type string. And I don't think we need to supply a default value. Actually, it looks like maybe we do. So let's say this is just an empty string by default. And I'm just going to copy and paste this a few times. We'll go ahead and say this is first name. This one is last name. And what's the last one? This one is user ID. Let's go ahead and just update these accordingly. This will be last name. And this here will be first name and email. So now that we've got these set up, we can actually assign it with all of these values down here. So we can go ahead and say self.email is going to equal email, self.userid is going to equal user ID, self.firstname is first name, but we're going to coalesce this to a default value. And the reason being is because some of these properties that Apple gives us back are in fact optional. So we want to make sure we don't assign nil to it. So we'll give default values with the double question mark. And that's basically all that we need to do. So let's go ahead and run this in a simulator, and let's see if my simulator environment decides to cooperate. So we'll go ahead and build and run, and hopefully it shows up. There it is. We're in dark mode, so we'll see if the light mode button actually decides to work. And the one thing that I'll actually call out once this loads up the app here is you need to sign into your Apple ID on the simulator to be able to test it here, otherwise it won't work. So let me just show you guys that real quick. If I open up my settings app, you can see that I'm signed into one of my Apple IDs up here. You would see a sign in button as this first cell in the table. but you do need to sign in to get this working. So let's go ahead and hit this, and we'll actually get our sign-in sheet where we can go ahead and change our name. We can choose if we want to share our email. Sure, why not? We can also say hide my email, which I don't really care about. We'll go ahead and continue, and let's see if it decides to, let's see, enter the password for this to continue. Well, I don't really want to enter this right now. I was going to just enter password and see if that worked, but looks like it's going to show you guys my password. So we're going to forego this, but that's basically how you would set up sign in with Apple in a nutshell. So the one thing that I did want to cover, which I'll still cover even though we're not signing in, is how do you manage the state of, with the whether or not we showed this button or not, the user is signed in or not. It's pretty simple actually. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'll implement it here. So what we care about is if this user ID is set. So I'm going to say if user ID is empty, we know that we are not signed in because it should not be empty once we have signed in. So what we can do is we can take this whole thing and we can drop it in right there. And if it isn't empty, aka the else block, we are signed in and we can show the user's account or whatever UI we would need to. Now you could do a little bit of factoring out as well to clean this up. Now I've chosen not to in my case, but what I would personally do is create an environment object to hold all this data, and you could actually move this sign in with Apple button into like some other entire view. So you could take this whole thing and maybe create another view down here called, let's see, sign in button view, like that. And this of course would extend view, and it would have a body just like any SwiftUI view. I would drop that in like that. And you would bring in all these app storage properties. I guess you can leave these here also since they are the same key, but you can also drop these in like so, just to make sure that this guy doesn't yell at us. You'll also want to bring in the environment here so the button can configure itself in terms of the color scheme. And that's basically all you need to do to abstract it out. And then what I would do here is we would say, sign in button view, just like that. And if you want to make this even cleaner, what you could go ahead and do is you can make a computed property here. You can say private var is signed in, and this is signed in would basically be a boolean which would be computed from whether or not the user ID is empty, rather the inverse of it. So if it's not empty, we are signed in. And here we're going to go ahead and say if we're not signed in, go ahead and show the sign in button. Otherwise, you can go ahead and show welcome back to your account. And that is basically sign in with Apple in a nutshell. So all you really need to do is implement the button and a couple of these closures here. I would definitely recommend abstracting it out to its own view. It makes your content view a lot cleaner, and the fact that there's also like business logic in here makes it a little dirty and verbose, so just be mindful of that. So the other thing I'll mention is we're saving the email and all this personal info into user defaults. You might want to encrypt it. You might want to save it in the user's keychain for better security. And you also definitely want to go ahead and check for the error cases here, whether these things are empty or not. So instead of just assigning this, you might want to unwrap it and bind the email, first name and last name to some value. And if they're nil for whatever reason, you want to handle the error appropriately and not just just assume it'll work, because that's never good for any user. But that's all I've got for you guys today. That's sign in with Apple in a nutshell in SwiftUI. If you're working with UIKit, I've got a separate video of this process with UIKit, so definitely check that out. If you haven't destroyed the like button already and you're into iOS and you enjoyed the video, make sure to do so for the YouTube algorithm. Hit subscribe if you want to stick around and help us grow the channel continuously up and onwards. And leave a comment if you have any questions, feedback, video ideas, suggestions. Always like hearing from you guys, and I always enjoy making videos that you actually want to see. So that all said, thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.